everybody. Hey, welcome. Hope you're having fun at WhimsyCon. I know it just started, but hope you're having fun. Happy Friday night. I'm Colleen, and I'm with Nerd Alert News. You can find me on all the social medias as Nerd Alert News. Okay, so it's nice and easy. I'm going to introduce our guest of honor tonight. Can you guys hear me okay? Sweet. So, our guest tonight is a winner of the Nebula, Hugo, and World Fantasy Awards. He is the author of Dandelion Dynasty, a silkpunk epic fantasy series it starts out with The Grace of Kings, as well as The Paper Menagerie and other stories, The Hidden Girl and other stories, and Ken's world of the Dandelion Dynasty and his creation of this silkpunk setting is what inspired the 2023 theme that we have here for WhimsyCon this year, weaving grand tales of technology and magic. So let's have a warm welcome for Ken Liu.
Thank you, Colleen. Thank you. So everyone can hear me okay, right? Okay, awesome. So what I'm going to do tonight is we're going to have a conversation with Colleen, obviously, but before that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my work and read to you a little bit from one of my stories. So I'm very envious of other artists because it seems like other artists are always, when they work in other mediums, they always have an easier relationship with time than I do. Right? So if you're a visual artist, oftentimes you can show the work to the audience at the same time as you're talking about it. Like, it doesn't take very long for the audience to have a cool aesthetic experience with visual art. If you're playing music, you can take the audience through a piece and share that experience at the same time. Fiction, on the other hand, is weird because it's an art form that's best enjoyed solitarily. You have to have your own individual engagement with the text at your own pace as you like it, right? And it tends to be a very solitary experience. So when authors try to talk about their work, we try to compensate for this in multiple ways. Some authors like to show adaptations of their work, so they do a screening, which I think is kind of cheating. Other artists try to do a reading. Now that really only worked with poets. Fiction writers, it's not really that great a substitute because part of the point of fiction is you can engage with it at your own pace. And when you're doing a narration, you're sort of forcing the audience into a particular pace, which is not always the right thing to do. So all that is to say that as an artist, I have a very hard time with public performances because my art seems to be ill-suited for it. But nonetheless, I do want to read to you from this particular story, largely because it's about time, and time is something I obsess with a lot. If you think about it, time is such a weird thing, right? We think of time as objectively existing, but it's really not. It's deeply tied into our subjective experience of it. And in fact, I wrote the story called Timekeeper's Symphony because I was really obsessed with timekeeping and the technology of timekeeping. So a little bit about me, right? My background is in technology. Spent many years working in the technology industry, and then later on, I was in the law, and I was a corporate lawyer, and also I served as a litigation consultant in patent cases. So I testified and explained to the jury and the judge how technology works. So I have a lot of experience and interest in technology and in technology as a form of, as a very essential part of human nature, right? So my theory is in our traditional binary view of the world, there's human nature and then there's technology, right? The idea is somehow technology is opposed to human nature. I think that's a deeply flawed way of thinking, right? You can't really understand beavers if you don't understand the dams they build, and you cannot understand termites without understanding the mounds they build. So what makes you think you can understand human nature without understanding human craft? We are a species that externalize our minds to a degree that's rarely seen in the animal world, right? Every time you interact with a piece of technology, whether it's a phone or a piece of chalk or a ceramic bowl, you're really interacting with somebody else's mind externalized, right? And then as you're interacting with it, you put some of your own mind into it. We are such a science fictional species. We literally interact with bits of other human minds on a daily basis. It's amazing. And it's not just artifacts, right? We interact with calendars, with clocks, with legal fiction, with corporate entities, which are all externalizations of someone's mind. We are such a species steeped in technology. It's really hard for us to understand who we are without accounting for all of that, right? So time, in particular, is super fascinating to me. We've been tracking time and keeping time since forever. But did you ever think about the fact that as we have grown as a species, the way we think about time has also drastically shifted, right? It really sunk in on me when I was writing this story to sort of research the history of timekeeping and how the very concept of a second has changed over time. Okay, so think about this. A second is a fundamental unit today in the way in our system of measures and units, right? But that has not always been the case, and in fact, a second was traditionally a very derivative unit, right? The foundational unit for humans is the year or the day. Those were the foundational units, right? The earliest clocks were the sundials. So the earliest timepiece we had was the rotation of the Earth and the orbit of the Earth around the sun. And as you know, a day is longer in the summer and shorter in the winter. So that means an hour, which was a division of the day, also grew and shrank based on seasons. And a minute and a second, which are divisions of the hour, also grew and shrank during that time, right? So the foundational unit when we first started keeping time was the year or the day, and hours and seconds and minutes were just fractions thereof, and they grew or shrank based on the seasons. Now, at some point, we stopped doing that, largely when we started having to explore the world and we have to use clocks to keep longitude, okay? That was when we started having clockwork, right? We realized that the oscillator is the way to track time. We have to find some sort of independent physical system, the oscillator. The oscillator became the foundational timekeeping device for every single timekeeping piece of technology, whether it's a mechanical clock or a pendulum, or the vibration of a piece of crystal as in quartz watches, or even now in the super fine structure of the anti-parallel alteration of the furthermost electron inside a cesium atom. That's how we track time now, but it's still fundamentally the same thing. It's just a little oscillator that vibrates back and forth. Okay, so at some point, we started thinking of a second as the foundational unit and built other things out of it. We no longer track time using the orbit of the Earth, but we still had to sort of sync the two together somehow, right? So that was when we went into this huge discussion about how do we measure the precise length of a year of the Earth's orbit around the sun, and then tie everything to that, okay? So this was when we had to sort of realize that the Earth's own rotation has slowed down over time, and even the period by which the Earth rotates around the sun alters from year to year. And so that's why we had to sort of go into this great deal of soul searching about how to define a second based on this inconstant clock. It turns out that the clock we rely on the most, the orbit of the Earth, is inconstant. And that was not a good thing to have if you want to have a precise definition of time. So that's when, sometime in the 60s, we had this foundational shift, okay? That was when we defined the second as the foundational unit. It's a total reverse from how things have been done in the past. In the past, the second was always a fraction of the year. But starting in the 60s, we shifted around to the idea of the second being fundamental. And the second was defined, as I said earlier, based on the anti-parallel oscillation of the furthermost electron in the orbit of the cesium atom. From that moment on, we became a cosmic species, right? Because at that moment, the definition of the second was tied to the orbit of the Earth just for that particular year. They took that year, divided it into equal units of particular number of units, and called that a second, and then figure out how many oscillations of the radiation equal that period of time, and that became the second. So from that time on, the Earth might slow down or speed up, or the orbit might change, but we're not going to change the definition of the second anymore. The second was fixed at that moment. We became a cosmic species. We started to separate our own conception of time away from the Earth. It's a really profound cosmic moment, and I sort of wonder why we don't think more about it. Like, that was a fundamental change in the way we thought about time. Anyway, I have tons of other thoughts about time like that. All of it is put into this little story. This is a particular genre I enjoy writing, which is sci-fi taken to its essence. I write a particular style of sci-fi. Not all my stories are like this, but some of them are. So there's a story I wrote a long time ago called The Bookkeeping Habits of Select Species. Some of you may know it. This piece, Timekeeper Symphony, is of the same genre. Basically, these are stories that have no plot and no characters. They're essentially just world building. You can think of them as fictional essays of things that I enjoy. And I'm hoping that you guys will actually enjoy reading it as well. So without further ado, I will read to you a little bit from the first movement of the story called Timekeeper Symphony. To keep time, you must first invent it. Movement 1, flicker, apiature. Time travels in diverse paces with diverse persons. I'll tell you who time ambles without, who time trots without, who time gallops without, and who he stands still without. William Shakespeare, As You Like It, Act 3, Scene 2. In the cloud forests of Pax Sigma 2, the inhabitants do not keep time, but stretch and slice it. The first humans who arrived on the planet were amazed by the fauna. There's the stone-armored Petrodraken, draped in 20,000 scales, each a meter across, who lays a clutch of eggs only once every 1,009 times Pax Sigma 2 has revolved around its prime sun. There's the glass-winged sleek fly, whose two-phase life cycle, alternating between coniphyte and nephelphyte generations, lasts a brilliant 70 seconds, the average duration it takes for the living silicon snowflakes to drift from the mist-shrouded canopy to the sulfur-infused earth. There's the deep-sea abyssal binasan, who slithers no more than a centimeter in a century. There's the red-shafted needlebeak, whose erratic darting flight, changing direction 100 times a second, can make a single mating pair appear to be a whole swarm to the novice observer. On no other planet has life evolved to occupy so many time scales and niches all at once. It is a temporal Galapagos, a Mendelian garden of crisscrossing timelines. Are they sentient? Does the Petrodraken make long-lasting landscape art with the aid of erosion? Does the needlebeak compose poetry with an alphabet of movements too quick for us to parse? Does the binasa leave books behind in its lightless trail, which millions of generations of sleek-sleeved nephelmorph larvae can read in due course when the ocean has turned into mountains. While the question of whether the nature of the universe is continuous or discrete remains hotly debated, there is sufficient consensus that consciousness doesn't so much flow like a smooth river as leap forward from moment to moment, a glistening frog atop drifting lily pads. The biological circuitry of cognition, of the machinery of life, is full of discrete steps and sinusoidal waves, alternating peaks and troughs imposed by unbending physics. Spiking neurons have refractory periods. Ion channels open and close like pumping gates. Neurochemical concentrations require the passage of time to change as well as to stabilize. And so life proceeds by jerks, twitches, bounces, quivers, though we pretend otherwise. As you gaze across a vista, to give the photoreceptors in your retina the conditions to yield a steady signal and to minimize the amount of signal processing by the visual pathways, your eyes don't glide over the visual field, but hop across it in rapid saccades, leaving the brain's visual system the task of stitching the series of flickering, fixed retinal images into one continuous, fluid scene. As you stride along, you speed up and slow down, fall toward the ground and catch yourself, teeter to one side and then totter to the other, each step a complex series of three-dimensional coordinate transformations conducted in jerky segments. Nevertheless, what you perceive is only smooth forward progress, a continuous illusion integrated from the tick-tock of the body's million, billion, distinct, pulsing, beating, pumping, swinging, oscillating clocks. Blending the discrete into the continuous is the glamour that brings the world as we sense it into being. Vibrations, up, down, fuse into notes. Flickers, now you see it, now you don't. Meld into persistence of vision. Without it, we would have no motion pictures, no screens, no virtual reality, no scripted deep dreams. You never notice the ticking clock cycles that power the artificial silicon and germanium brains that give us so many simulated worlds, now do you? The smaller the flickers in our perception, the more details we notice and the longer time seems to last. So why don't we simply slice time into the finest slivers possible, live life at the highest resolution? There's a cost, it turns out, to dividing time into ever finer fractions of a second. To use a not entirely inaccurate metaphor, the faster the frame rate of perception, the more it costs metabolically. A year seems to last so much longer for growing children, it is said, at least in part because their consciousness is processing reality faster than the slowing chronoperceptors of their aged parents. They literally experience more of the stream of time. To the lumbering petrodragon, we are but lightning flashes, our entire life arc summed up at most with a single quadratic approximation. We burn our candle at both ends. No wonder we're born and die before the petrodragon has completed even one thought. To the fluttering needlebeak, on the other hand, we are akin to ungainly giants trapped in viscous sap, awkward mannequins on a stop-motion set, flipbooks in the hands of a novice user. Hours pass before we change from one pose to another, our minds as alien as the carbon dioxide glaciers on the horizon. We may live their eons, but at the expense of a metabolic frugality that makes our life dim, dull, a mere stone skipping over the river of existence, missing all the fun. Little wonder, then, that the settlers of Pike Sigma II began to look for new ways to inhabit the stream of time. Slow down or speed up. Altering the metabolic clock is the only way to meet the inhabitants of the planet in their own temporal realms. So cytonides injected into the body build a new network of semiconducting neural sheaths. RNA lexical closures rewrite the human genome to adopt new metabolic pathways. Ion pumps and protein-etched integrated circuits alter and upgrade the neuroelectronics of consciousness signal processing. Blood vessel walls are strengthened with carbon nanotubes. Muscles are replaced with fast-acting memory polymers. Bones are converted to composite metamaterials. Blood is supplanted with cellular nanomanufacturers. To give observers an easy way of knowing the new temporal realm they've moved into, each techinaut wears an indicator device on their wrist. While these appear superficially like the products of haute horlogerie, closer examination reveals a key difference. Instead of a harmonic oscillator in the form of a balance wheel and hairspring or a magnetic pendulum, the escapement of the watch is driven by a pressure plate against the inside of the wearer's wrist, converting each pulse of the radial artery into a swing of the pallet fork. Instead of measuring the passage of seconds, the hands of the watch advance with the pace of the wearer's heartbeat. The faster the heart beats, the faster the hands swing around the dial. Techinauts literally live at different speeds from the rest of us. Some now see the world as a darting needlebeak does, a summer in an hour, a lifetime in a day. Their heart beats so fast that it no longer sounds like a flutter, but a single note. Though they will not live to see the sun rise again, some speculate that because they slice time so finely, they're closer to the fundamental quantum vibration of the universe. Thus, they derive more joy, sorrow, rage, surprise, and empathy from each second than most of us can experience in a lifetime. Others, ambassadors to the Petrodraken, skip over Heraclitus' river in long, graceful arcs. To the rest of humanity, they seem to live in a perpetual state of slumber, barely distinguishable from statues, each breath spanning days, each heartbeat a somber larghissimo pianto. With such slow clocks of consciousness, they'll likely outlive the rise and fall of would-be galactic empires, perhaps even witness the end of our species. Years are experiencing a single second. The flickering alternation of day and night fuses into a single perpetual twilight. We may think that such a life of languor, like mortally immortal Tithonus, to be not worth living. But perhaps to them, we seem like carping mayflies, lacking all sense of the scale of the divine clockwork. All this, of course, remains conjecture. None of the explorers of other scales of time have ever returned. The modifications required to become a techinaut are so extensive that they're irreversible. But one can't help wonder that even if they could return, they wouldn't. Perhaps they find their new temporal existence much more interesting than their native realm. Or perhaps they, new converts to Marvellian metaphysics, are reluctant to inform us that lightning fast or vegetal slow, we would never have world enough nor time. Thank you. This is published in Clark's World, so if you're interested in reading the rest of the story and the other three movements, you can find it there. Okay.
Wow. Anyone else mind blown? I was just mesmerized. All right, so let's just start a Q&A here, and I'm going to ask them a couple of questions, and I'm going to open it up to the floor. Okay, well, I'm just going to break the cardinal Q&A rule, question rule, right off the bat, and make a statement, which they always tell you never to. But I just have to tell you that how cool is it that heroes in your books are, they're engineers, like from School of Mines, and they're not just wizards. I just think that's amazing, and I bet you've inspired a lot of people, and I just want to tell you that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just think that's really cool.
Go ahead.
No, I mean, man,
That's
you got
your
something to add
statement.
to that. Please, that was my statement, but please add to it. I just think that's amazing.
I was just going to say that, I've always been very resistant to the idea, as I said earlier, that human nature is opposed to technology. And so I've often tried to make this comparison between engineering and poetry. What I mean is this: for those of us who have spent a lot of time working in the arts as well as in engineering, there really is a lot of similarity between the two disciplines. So when you're learning to be a poet, you're really learning a repertoire of techniques that other poets have invented. You have to sort of learn these techniques And then what you want to do is you have to use them and marshal them and deploy them in the creation of new symbolic artifacts that create new effects. So I always say that, this is something that's very familiar to all of us, because as a species, we're always learning to use secondhand words to tell original stories, right? Literally every word we use has been used by other people. We're not the inventors of these words, but in combining them into these new artifacts, we are expressing things that have never been expressed before. And that's what poets do. They often are marshaling old techniques and breathing new life into them to say something that's never been said before. And in time, the new combinations become their own new techniques that other poets will then build on. So engineers do essentially the same thing. When you're studying engineering, you are not really studying what is necessarily a science. It's an art that you're studying. You're learning known solutions to known problems. You learn a repertoire of techniques for solving various problems, and then you combine them to solve new problems. So you learn what a capacitor does, you learn what a resistor does, you learn what this particular IC chip does. And then you say, okay, I'm building a new game console. So how do I put these pieces together to achieve the result I want? How do I get a steady signal to the sound chip? How do I filter out the noise? What are the devices I can use? And eventually, when your solution is mature enough, it will be miniaturized and learned as a technique by somebody else, and then put into their own creations as they invent their own devices. You just build on this generation after generation. It's how language works, it's how poetry works, how engineering works. There is something deeply, fundamentally the same in every poet and in every engineer. It's really the same thing, which I think is something that we don't emphasize enough. It's something very human, the way we approach the problem and trying to solve it. And so, in fact, I would say that the genre of science fiction is often actually sort of misnamed. A lot of what we think of as science fiction is really not science fiction. It's really technology fiction. It's tech-fi. Because a lot of the times what we really love in that style of sci-fi is this inventiveness in solving problems. That's what we really enjoy. There is also science fiction that's actually focused on the science part of it, but science and technology are very different disciplines. And sometimes, the focus on the science part of sci-fi sort of disregards and erases the technology part. I also think that, fundamentally, for technology to be really interesting, it has to be understood as a language, and therefore there has to be some aspect of magic to it. I like to turn that old quote around. Any sufficiently advanced technology is in fact magical, not just because we interact with it that way, but because we have to humanize it by putting magic into it. And I don't mean this in a negative way. I think magical thinking is fundamental to our species. A lot of times the way we make things work and we make life tolerable and we make sense of the world is through this sort of metaphorical, magical leaps. And that's essential in technology as it is in art. And I work with a lot of artists who are incredibly brilliant engineers, and there really is no divide between art and engineering at that level. Some of these artists create beautiful devices using AI, and they think very deeply about what AI really means. And to do what they do, they have to be simultaneously practicing magic as well as engineering. And so I really do think they're very elite.
I need a button that says I'm a magical thinker.
Right.
Okay, one more question now. I'm going to open it up to you guys. Well, so many of your stories are, your characters and your stories, they have so much nuance and complexity. How do you create these amazing characters? Or is it just too broad of a question?
It's
so much.
It's a great question. I mean, I write very different styles of fiction. I mean, this sort of thing has no characters in it at all. You know, I remember when I wrote the Bookmaking Habits of Select Species, that one was actually nominated for Nebula, and I remember at the time, a lot of readers were very angry about it, and they said, this is not even a story. There's no characters, you know, what the hell is this, you know? I mean, I think people eventually came around and thinking that this is actually kind of cool, but it is weird, right? It has no characters in it. But at the same time, I do write a lot of fiction that's very character-driven. And I guess the way I think about it is, I think humans, you know, we evolved to be social creatures. So the thing that fascinates us the most is complex inner worlds. We really do like the idea of trying to figure out what someone else is thinking. And when it's difficult, we're actually very intrigued. We like that. I think we tend to be drawn to people who we perceive as having rich inner lives, who have complicated thoughts and complicated emotions and all sorts of tricks up their sleeves. And we like that. And so when I write characters, I just sort of think about, you know, the fact that we are all heroes of our own epic fantasies. You know, the villain does not think that she's the villain. The villain clearly has her own story in which she is the hero. And, you know, she may be right and she may be entirely wrong, but nonetheless, it's important to be empathetic to everybody and to write their story as though that were true. And I do want to say, you know, it's very important to keep in mind that being empathetic to your character is not the same thing as being sympathetic to them. You can be empathetic to villains without necessarily being drawn into their orbit and start thinking that what their own story is actually the right story. But it is important to actually understand that story and to be empathetic to it, because only then can you actually write the character in a way that feels genuine and real and honors the common humanity, even in the worst of us.
I love that answer. All right, does anybody else have questions? Raise your hand if you do.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you liken poetry to technology, to engineering. But I think about this in terms of prose. Like, prose is full of technologies. And so I'm curious, what technologies do you feel in your prose that you apply most often? How do you get the most out of those technologies? How do you get the...
Oh man, that is a great question. So I have this theory. I could be right, I could be wrong, but I think every writer is really, when we talk about practicing our craft, what we're really talking about is trying to invent the language that's capable of telling the stories we want to tell. Because none of us want to write in cliches, right? I mentioned earlier that we're all using secondhand words to tell original stories. Yes, that is true. You start out by using cliches. That's how you learn. You have to learn this repertoire of known solutions. But at some point, you're going to realize that this is not enough, that somehow the things that are out there that already exist are not enough to tell the stories you want to tell. You see things. You know, I tell this semi-mystical story. It's like you're a kid and you're out in the woods just exploring. And then suddenly you hear this cry overhead and you look up and there's a dragon flying overhead, right? And you return home and you're so excited. And you try to describe the dragon and you try to draw the dragon, you try to paint the dragon, you try to dance the dragon so that people can see what you saw. And you can't, because it's something that's never been done before. You don't have the words for it, you don't have the technique. You have to invent the technique for that. That's what writers are trying to do. They all have their own dragon that they're trying to convey to the reader, and they don't know how because they have to invent the technique that will be capable of conveying it has not yet been invented. So writers are always trying to invent the language. So that process of inventing your own language is, you know, what we describe as practicing your craft, and that may mean discovering a particular rhythm, a particular structure, a particular sentence form that will convey what you want to do. I actually realized throughout my career that the way lawyers express themselves, or the way lawyers learn to express themselves, is actually very inspiring to me as a technique. You know, I trained as a lawyer for many years, and I worked in litigation and in contract drafting. And it's really fascinating to me how legalese evolved over time. You know, legalese is just a fascinating example of human technology in action. So oftentimes, right, you will see lawyers say things that we would never say in real life. You know, why do you have to say I give, bequeath, devise, over, give over, and in every other manner convey? Like, why do you say things in that way? What is the point of that? And you go back and you realize, oh, actually there is a point, because every single one of those phrases was settled by some court case. So when lawyers put them in there in that way, it's a form of over-engineering. It's the belts and suspenders approach. It's building a really strong bridge. It's the idea that even if this one part fails, there are these other parts that hold it up. So lawyers are, like, in some ways, the most conservative but also skilled civil engineers. They engineer their thing to have like 1000% tolerance, right? So, you know, I contrast this with the kind of engineering that's described in the code equations, which I assume is a story most of you know. If you don't, I don't think I'll spoil by telling you that the code equations is this classic story in which there's a spaceship being sent to deliver some vaccines, I believe, to another planet. And halfway along the journey, they find there's a girl who's a stowaway on the ship. And the ship is designed in such a way that the tolerances are nil. The fact that there's this girl on the ship means that everybody is doomed. There's not enough to get them there, and they have to throw her out the airlock. This story has always been sort of described as, you know, showing the wonder and cruelty of the universe and how unbending the laws of physics are. I think it's ridiculous. This is a story about bad engineering. Who engineer like this? This is just not how you do it. You design a bridge such that one extra feather on the truck will collapse it. Who thinks this is a good idea? So, no. But if you have lawyers do this, this would never have happened. Lawyers will engineer this thing to be 1000%, you know, tolerant. So anyway, I actually ended up really enjoying the way lawyers write, because there's a quality to the way lawyers draft their prose. There's a kind of cautious empathy, if you will, in there. And lawyers often write in a way that accounts for the possibility of misunderstanding. And sometimes they make misunderstanding the deliberate point of agreement. Oftentimes, the two parties to a contract actually can't agree. And the lawyers just end up finding a way to say things in such a way that the two parties will interpret it as they like. And they'll think they have agreement when they in fact don't. This is what allows deals to be done. Now you'll say that they're just postponing the problem later to litigation, which is, you know, sometimes true. But a lot of times this kind of ambiguity is what allows minds to meet. A lot of human interaction is about the ability to connect on these points of ambiguity. So anyway, long meandering answer to your question. A lot of my own prose experimentation and prose techniques are actually very much drawn from my history as a lawyer. I really like the way of thinking about language as a medium, as a bridge that can bear extra weight. I really like thinking about language as a point of ambiguity, of strategically using ambiguity to capture multiple points of view. So if there is anything that's particularly interesting about the way I've come to invent the prose that I use, is that it does draw very heavily from legal training, but not necessarily in the way that people think of it. I think a lot of times when people talk about lawyers, they talk about how clear they are and how precise they are. I don't actually think that's really the thing about lawyers that's interesting. I think it's the stuff that I was talking about.
That was a great answer. All right, any other questions?
I'll do my best to try and phrase this right. So, it feels like in a lot of your work, there's this kind of thematic motive of people needing to be aware of the universality of experiences, but the unique combination of individual circumstances creating something new that is also still not new. And I'm just wondering, is that something that you were intending to do? Is it something that you feel is a message?
So I struggle a lot with this concept of universality versus the personal. And it has to do with all sorts of complicated feelings about colonialism, about being an immigrant, about just the alienation of modernity. So I'll give you a very concrete example, right? So when we say something is universal, what do we really mean by that, right? It's actually worth delving a little bit deeper into that. So, for example, right, there is a tradition, a long tradition in American schools. I mean, it's true in Europe too, but I'll use American schools as an example, where we teach literature with a capital L one way, and then we teach diverse literature a different way, okay? So literature, let's say Milton and Shakespeare, right? The idea is these may be stories about, Verona or ancient Greece or whatever, but that's not the point. That's really not the point. This is universal. This is meant to be understood by everybody, literally everybody. Even if you are, your experiences are so far away from this that you cannot even map these words. It doesn't matter. As soon as you figure out the words, you will feel the power of the story as a universal story, okay? But then on the other hand, there are diverse literature stories, right? In which we study a story from each country or from each continent or from each group as a way of understanding that group, right? So the story is not to be understood as universal in the sense that this is meant for everybody, but as a peculiar way of reflecting an experience outside the mainstream, okay? Now, I'm exaggerating a little bit for effect here, and I don't think the teachers mean to do this, but for better or worse, that is oftentimes how this kind of teaching ends up doing. And so, writers who are ethnic, writers who are queer, writers who are women even, often feel like they're not writing universal stories, right? So if you're Sylvia Plath, you end up essentially in some ways commoditizing your pain, your suffering, your personal experience for consumption, right? So I have a friend who is Black, and he put this very eloquently, and he said that, I do not understand that why the only time you pay attention to Black writers is when we're performing our pain. Like, is that the only thing we are allowed to do and that's worthwhile? Like, why is this the only thing that I can do that you will praise me for? Like, why do you not see this as a universal aspect of the human experience? And that's always stuck with me, this obsession with universality versus particularity. What does that mean? So I will say that, personally, I actually had this terrible experience for a little bit of time where, as Colin mentioned, one of the stories that I'm known for is called The Paper Menagerie. And that story is very much about systemic racism and about the experience of identifying, of internalized racism and all the rest of it. And I remember that when I was doing a literary festival in Hong Kong, and because the festival was in English, most of the attendees are expats living in Hong Kong. They're expat Americans living in Hong Kong. And one of the readers came up to me afterwards and said, you're not what I expected. And I said, how? And he said, well, you're not biracial. And I'm like, that is true. I'm not sure why you thought I was biracial. He said, well, that means The Paper Menagerie is not actually your story. He said, oh, you mean like, is it autobiography? No, it's not, although I don't know what gave you the first clue. Do you normally have origami animals coming to life in your experience? And he was like, oh, so it's fiction. He was like, it's fiction. I was like, yes, it is fiction. And then he's like, well, then I don't like it as much. And that really drove me nuts, like the idea that the value of my story is that it in some way commoditized a personal pain for him, or at least that's how he perceived it. And so for a while, I didn't want to write any stories that might be read as particular in that sense. I wanted to write universal stories, whatever that meant. And I'm sure this is an experience a lot of artists have had. You know, if you're queer, you often would be like, okay, maybe I'll deliberately not write characters who are queer because I want to be universal. You know, I'm a woman, so I'm going to deliberately write only male protagonists. I'm not white, but I'm going to write only about white characters. I mean, you know, people have different reactions and different aesthetic reasons and drives, but I do think that when you feel the pressure to write universal stories because you think certain types of people in certain stories are more universal than others, then you're doing yourself a big disservice, and you're also reinforcing the very thing that pushed you into that place in the first place. Anyway, long story short, I'm now of the belief that everyone should tell the story that they want to tell. So I always say this to people, and I think sometimes people don't quite get how important it is to me. I really think it's very important for everybody to tell the story they want to tell, because that's actually much harder than you might think. Just one, knowing what story you want to tell, as opposed to what you think other people want to hear. Very hard to know what story you want to tell, and then to be able to actually have the courage to do that, to feel like you're telling the story as opposed to performing for other people, as opposed to offering up your own pain to be commoditized. Like, to be able to tell your own story the way you want to tell, that is hard. And that, I think, is the highest state any artist can achieve, because it's in that specificity of the story that you want to tell, that we really reach universality, whatever that means, because it shows that we're all quirky, we're all strange, we're all freaking weird, and yet somehow we try to understand each other. We try to actually have empathy for each other. We try to actually touch and connect. That is freaking awesome. That is amazing.
I hit you right here. Oh my gosh, that was emotional. Oh,
5.
thank
Oh,
you.
we still have 5 minutes. Okay, awesome.
Woo, that fast. Okay.
Yes.
Question.
Hi, I love your stories, and many of the time when I'm reading your stories, I feel like it's so real. I can't really tell the difference between fictional stories and real life. Like many of your stories are based on or inspired by historical events, like
Yeah.
fairy tales, or more like recent events. So, how did you what is your process of writing? Like, did you read those stories or fairy tales or invent first and then decide like your own way of explaining it, or you have an idea first and just try to like fix it?
Well, you know, I think writers are always inspired by just pretty much everything around them. I'm actually going to do a workshop tomorrow called How to Build a More Compelling World that I hope some of you attend. It's not just for writers, it's actually meant for costumers, for people who are game designers, just anybody who wants to, build worlds. My theme, I mean, I'm not spoiling anything. To summarize my overall theme, it's the idea that in order to build a more compelling world, you just have to live a more compelling life. Really, that's fundamentally it. And it's the idea is, a lot of times when we focus so much on being creative and creating something original, whatever, we are not allowing ourselves the room to actually live and experience the world to its fullest. The more we open ourselves to just exploring the sort of things that we want to do, to actually exposing ourselves to new things, the more likely it is that we're going to find the story we want to tell. So a lot of my advice really is about just going out and trying things and build connections and experiencing things. It turns out that the more you write, the more ideas you have. The more connections you build with people, the more joyous and open you feel towards the world. This is something that is true, and I'm old enough to think that this actually may be real wisdom. And it's that it turns out that things like money and awards and titles and all this stuff, they really don't make you happy. They really don't. The things that actually end up making you happy are relationships. That's it. Just meaningful relationships. That more than anything will make you happy. I mean, they have done tons of psychological studies to show that this is true, but they could have skipped all of that. This is the sort of thing your grandmother told you. Like, you literally learned this stuff in kindergarten. Meaningful relationships with people, so much better. Like, if you're gonna have to take a job in which there are nice people who you can build relationships with is so much better than a job in which you sit alone and make a lot of money. It really is. And it's the same thing with any kind of creative work. Building relationships, building communities, building the sense of connection with other people, and ends up making you think better. Sometimes I think writers are afraid that if they open themselves up too much, they're not going to have any original ideas. Like, somehow originality requires you to isolate yourself away from the world. That may be true for some artists. I think for the vast majority of artists, they are likely to be more original and have more ideas the more they open themselves up to experiences. So anyway, long-winded answer to your question. My process largely involves just wasting a lot of time. I talk to people, I play, that's what I do. I go to conferences, I talk to people. I'm sort of like, oh, what do you do? And I try to find out what they do. And amazingly, almost always it ends up being super helpful because, later on I'm writing something like, oh, I know this artist who has done exactly this. I'm going to talk to her and see, what her experience is. It just turns out that, that sort of simple thing really ends up being super helpful.
Love that. I guess we're out of time. That went so fast. I was just hanging on his every word. But thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you
for
so much. I hope you guys all come to this conference.